The textbook legislative process makes it appear as though there are a series of discrete steps in the legislative process, and that when you check off one, you simply move to the next, you work through that, you check that off, you move to the next. In fact, the legislative process is much messier. Of course, there's the saying that the two things you don't ever want to see being made are laws and sausages. In terms of thinking about lawmaking, the legislative process starts with an idea that someone or a group of people might have, and then it really is a process of persuading 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate that that idea is the most important idea that has come along as compared with all of the other 3,000 ideas that might circulate during any given congressional session. And that's a hard thing to do. And persuasion is a hard thing to engage in. And that's really what the legislative process is all about. So members of Congress rely on their personal relationships with colleagues. They rely on friendships that they've made, especially political friendships where they've worked with somebody in the past and now they're going to call in that favor that they might have. One of the most significant aspects of the legislative process is understanding the formal rules of the game, the actual rules of procedure in both chambers, and then also understanding how you can work around those if needed in order to accomplish your objectives. So in terms of how the legislative process works, it's really not straightforward, it's not linear. It's a back and forth between members and their colleagues, between members of the House and members of the Senate. It's a back and forth often with the president, who might want something to be accomplished, and members of Congress might want something somewhat different. And so all of that back and forth goes into whether or not a piece of legislation is ultimately passed.
Let's talk a little bit about the lawmaking process as it actually really works. And beginning with this basic skeletal structure of a bill going through the House and then going through the Senate and the like. The first thing that we need to recognize is that a bill doesn't have to start in the House, it can actually start in the Senate. A second thing is there are specific rules that decide which committee a bill would go to, if it would be referred to the Ways and Means Committee or the Commerce Committee or the Education and Labor Committee. And those rules exist. They've been written by members of the House and Senate to create a jurisdiction, okay, for each committee. When that bill goes to a committee, most of the time it's actually not going to make it out of the committee because the committee doesn't have the capacity to process every single bill that's introduced by the House, or introduced by a member in the House or in the Senate. Okay. The committees themselves vary in terms of their motives, in terms of their structure, in terms of their size, and they're essentially created to divide the labor of the United States House and the United States Senate. But also, they exist to fulfill the goals of the individual members of Congress. And those goals are getting reelected, passing laws, or maybe gaining influence within the legislature. So when a bill goes to a committee, that you need to recognize first and foremost that not every committee is alike in terms of its structure, in terms of its leadership, in terms of what it's trying to do. Some of these committees, like say the Transportation Committee, are set up very well to serve the interest of particular constituents. We think of transportation as the means through which projects are funneled through particular districts, okay? On the other hand, the Ways and Means Committee in the House, the Senate Finance Committee in the Senate are committees that deal with big, huge national issues having to do with trade and taxes and entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. And so recognize that in the diagram of how a bill becomes a law, simply saying a bill goes to a committee and therefore it's discussed, doesn't tell us anything about the nature of the committee or the motives of the members or what have you. Over time, Congress has created subcommittees, and the number of subcommittees has ebbed and flowed. This is a way of breaking down the committee's jurisdiction into particular parts. So it's really important to understand in the lawmaking process that there's tremendous variation right at that point where it goes to committee.
The leadership is ridiculously powerful in terms of managing the House Rules Committee. We refer to it as the Speaker's Committee because the Speaker of the House gets to determine who sits on the Rules Committee. That's different from the other committees of jurisdiction within the House. So normally it would be up to the party as a whole to vote on committee chairs or vote on members for each of the committees. But when it comes to the Rules Committee, the Speaker is going to hand pick those people that he or she believes will do exactly what the Speaker wants them to do. And in terms of the distribution of majority party members to minority party members, there are 9 members of the majority party compared with 4 members of the minority party. So that means it would be almost impossible for the minority party to determine what rule of debate is attached to a piece of legislation. Now, I say almost impossible because from time to time we have had circumstances where a piece of legislation comes out of the Rules Committee and the rule that's attached is not at all what the Speaker might prefer. That's very rare because, again, the majority party members are hand-picked, but it is possible that that can happen.
The Senate, by the way, is very different from the House in terms of its lawmaking procedures. The Senate has no Rules Committee. The rules for debating a bill on the Senate floor is left up mainly to a negotiation between the majority leader and the minority leader of the Senate. They sit down and they try to work out what's called a unanimous consent agreement. When we say unanimous, we mean unanimous, as in everybody in the Senate has to agree to the terms under which this bill will be debated and amended on the floor. Well, that's hard to do. And so typically, a majority leader will try to bring a bill to the floor without an agreement. And at that point, you are subjecting the bill to the potential of what's called a filibuster, which most people think of as an extended debate. Mr. Smith goes to Washington. But in fact, the filibuster can take a variety of forms. It can be simply the threat by a member to say, well, if you bring this bill up, I will go to the floor and I'll begin talking.
One of the things that I think is underappreciated about the legislative process is the ways in which process itself can be hugely influential, not only in the creation of legislation, not only in terms of sort of what comes out of Congress, but also in terms of how the Congress interacts with the other branches. So in terms of what comes out, the most obvious example is something like the filibuster, where an internal congressional rule, right, a rule of the Senate about what it takes to get cloture on a bill, right, what it takes to bring something to a vote, winds up determining which bills pass into law, right? Only bills that can get the support of at least 60 senators wind up passing into law because of this internal procedural rule. So that's important, but also in terms of power vis-a-vis the other branches. So the congressional budget process, for example, is hugely important because it's designed to give Congress a counterweight to the executive branch. And this is another thing where it's proceeded in ebbs and flows throughout American history. So it was widely thought that there was a sort of period, that for much of American history there was congressional dominance of the budget process, that really from more or less the founding through the early 20th century, Congress really drove the budget process. In fact, in some cases, budget requests didn't even go through the president. They went directly from a department head, cabinet secretary, to the congressional appropriations committees. Then starting sort of shortly after World War I, we get this period inaugurated in the 1920s of what's widely regarded as presidential dominance of the budget process, where we get the creation of what was then called the Budget Bureau. It's now called the Office of Management and Budget. And it has this tremendous infrastructure. It collects the proposals from all the different branches, and then the president submits a formal budget request to Congress. Congress wasn't really set up to evaluate that budget request, so from the 1920s through the 1970s, we really had a period of presidential dominance of the budget process. And then in the 1970s, especially as a result of some of the distrust engendered by Watergate, Congress starts building its own capacity. So in the 1974 Budget Act, you get the creation of the budget committees, the creation of the congressional budget process, where the two houses pass a concurrent resolution that then sort of determines how the appropriations bills will be structured that year. You get the sort of beefing up of staffs that can actually serve as a counterweight to OMB in the White House. And so I think a lot of people would describe the period from about 1974 through the present as a period of sort of mixed power over appropriations, right? The White House is powerful, but so are the congressional budget and appropriations committees. So it's really a way in which Congress, through tweaking its own internal procedures, has allowed itself to have more of a say in these interbranch negotiations, and therefore more of a say over the sort of ultimate policy outcome.